For decades, wild boars have been one of the most destructive and unstoppable forces in the rural farming world, tearing through fields like living plows, uprooting crops overnight, and spreading devastation that could wipe out an entire season's hard work in a matter of hours. And in many countries, especially across Asia, Europe, and the southern United States, the boar problem wasn't just an agricultural inconvenience. It was an all-out war between man and beast. Farmers would wake up to find their rice paddies churned into muddy wastelands, corn stalks snapped and devoured, and potato fields looking like a battlefield after an airstrike. And the losses weren't just financial, they were emotional. Because to a farmer, each crop is not just food or money, it's a lifeline, a year's worth of sweat, and a gamble against nature itself. But boars, driven by their insatiable hunger, intelligence, and ability to breed at alarming rates, seemed immune to the traditional traps and deterrents, with entire herds learning to outwit farmers' methods within weeks. And no amount of electric fencing, poison bait, or hunting squads could keep their numbers under control. In fact, in regions like Vietnam and India, boar populations were exploding, with females producing litters of 4 to 6 piglets up to twice a year, and with no natural predators left in many areas, they multiplied into millions, pushing farmers into desperation and forcing them to innovate, which is where one of the most ingenious large-scale pest control strategies in modern history was born, not out of government labs or corporate research, but out of the minds of the farmers themselves, who realized that fighting the boars individually was a losing battle, but trapping them in massive numbers could finally tilt the war in their favor. And thus, the net strategy was conceived, a method that turned the boars' own habits against them, exploiting their tendency to travel in groups, follow food scents, and rush into perceived safe feeding zones. And unlike metal traps or pitfall designs, this system used lightweight, flexible, and nearly invisible netting stretched in wide arcs across forest edges and farmland perimeters, baited with irresistible fermented grain mixtures and fruit waste that could be smelled from over a kilometer away. And at first, boars approached cautiously, sniffing the bait, circling, testing for danger, but the nets, made of high-tensile synthetic fiber, were impossible for them to detect in low light, and as more animals joined, jostling for space at the bait site, a carefully timed trigger, often just a simple trip line or hidden rope, would send the net collapsing forward like a wave, entangling every single animal in a matter of seconds, with their powerful legs only making the fibers tighten around them as they thrashed. And here's the brilliance. The nets were designed not to kill, but to immobilize, meaning entire sounders of boars could be captured alive, reducing the chance of them escaping with a learned wariness of traps. And this catch-and-haul method allowed farmers to relocate or cull dozens at a time, drastically cutting down population pressure without needing constant gunfire or chemical poisons. And in just months, villages that had been losing up to 80% of their crops were suddenly seeing record harvests again, with the boar numbers dropping so sharply that some governments began studying the net strategy as a potential model for nationwide boar control, especially since it cost far less than high-tech alternatives and could be taught to any farming community, creating a rare example of grassroots innovation, outpacing official agricultural science. But behind the success were endless nights of trial and error, with farmers sleeping in makeshift huts near bait sites, adjusting net heights and trigger sensitivity, and sometimes even facing charging boars that sensed danger too late and fought violently to break free. And the stories from the front lines of this rural war are nothing short of cinematic. Old men recalling how they'd lost entire orchards year after year, finally standing over a dozen captured beasts in a single night. Young farmers turning the once back-breaking work of replanting after boar raids into a victory celebration, and entire communities gathering to help haul the nets, skin the animals for meat, and distribute it among the poorest families, transforming what had been a disaster into an unexpected food source. And as word spread, videos of the massive net drops went viral on social media, turning these rural heroes into internet sensations and drawing interest from wildlife experts, who saw in this farmer-led solution not just a way to protect crops, but a method that could be adapted for other invasive species as well, from deer in overpopulated zones to feral goats on islands, proving once again that necessity is the mother of invention, and that when pushed to the brink, ordinary people can outthink even the most cunning of natural adversaries. As the weeks turned into months, what began as a small-scale rural experiment with a few nets and handfuls of bait evolved into a coordinated, almost military-style operation spanning thousands of square kilometers, with farmers, hunters, and even schoolchildren playing a role in what some began calling the Great Boar Roundup. And the sheer efficiency of the method was staggering. While traditional hunting might remove 1 or 2 boars in a night, the net strategy was capable of capturing entire sounders numbering 20, 30, or even 50 animals in a single deployment. And when multiplied across hundreds of villages, this meant that within the first 6 months of widespread adoption, some regions reported over 5 million boars captured, either to be sold for meat, culled for pest control, or relocated to wildlife reserves where their numbers could be managed without impacting farmland. And because the nets were reusable, lightweight, and inexpensive compared to heavy steel traps or electric fencing, farmers were able to set up dozens at once, creating overlapping capture zones that acted almost like a biological minefield for the invasive herds, forcing them into narrow corridors where escape was nearly impossible. And it was in these corridors that the true genius of the strategy became clear. By using the boar's own movement patterns, gleaned from years of watching them raid crops, farmers could predict exactly where they would attempt to enter or exit fields, ensuring that the nets weren't just randomly placed, but strategically positioned for maximum effect. And as more boars were removed from the ecosystem, the pressure on remaining herds intensified, forcing them to take greater risks and wander into baited zones they would have once avoided, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of capture that accelerated population reduction beyond even optimistic projections. But the story didn't stop in the villages. Word of this grassroots victory spread to agricultural ministries, wildlife departments, and academic researchers, who began visiting the rural heartlands to study the method in detail, and soon, pilot programs were being funded in countries as far apart as Japan, where wild boar populations had exploded after depopulation of rural areas, and Texas, where feral hogs, close relatives of wild boars, were causing billions in damage to crops and infrastructure. And while adaptations had to be made for local conditions, the core principle remained the same. Use a flexible, invisible barrier to capture large groups alive, minimize animal stress to avoid spooking survivors, and deploy the system cheaply enough that even the poorest farming communities could afford it. And in places like India's northeast, where tribal farmers had been in a losing battle against boars for generations, the strategy became more than just a tool. It became a point of pride, a symbol that rural knowledge could outpace expensive imported solutions. And this cultural dimension made it even more powerful because it united entire communities in the effort, from children helping to mix fermented bait to elders standing guard at night. And the impact on the local economy was transformative. Not only were crop losses slashed by over 70% in the first year, but the captured boars became a new source of income through meat sales, leather, and even fertilizer made from rendered byproducts, turning a pest into a resource and creating a secondary industry in the process. Environmentalists, initially skeptical, began to warm to the idea when data showed that reducing boar populations allowed damaged ecosystems to recover, with forests showing signs of regrowth and smaller native species rebounding after years of being displaced by the aggressive foragers. And the scale of success was so unprecedented that international wildlife conferences featured presentations by humble village farmers, standing on stages in front of scientists and policymakers, explaining in their own words how a few nets and a lot of determination had achieved what millions in government funding had failed to do. And perhaps the most remarkable aspect was how the technique kept evolving. Farmers experimented with remote triggers linked to mobile phones, bait recipes optimized for different seasons, and even drone surveillance to track boar movements before deploying the nets, creating a fusion of old-world ingenuity and modern technology that pushed the method's efficiency to new heights. And by the time the third year of coordinated net operations rolled around, some estimates suggested that over 10 million boars had been captured worldwide using variations of the strategy, a figure that stunned even the most optimistic planners. And yet the true legacy of the net strategy might not be the sheer number of animals caught, but the proof it offered that local knowledge, sharpened by necessity and refined by collaboration, can solve problems that once seemed insurmountable. And today, when you walk through the once devastated rice fields of northern Vietnam, the corn plains of rural Spain, or the open farmlands of central Texas, you see more than healthy crops. You see a living reminder of how communities, pushed to the edge by an unstoppable foe, turned the tide with little more than rope, netting, and the will to defend what they had, leaving behind a story that future generations will tell not just as a tale of pest control, but as a lesson in resilience, innovation, and the quiet power of people who refuse to be beaten by nature's most relentless challenges.